Claire Bennett hit the bottom of the stairs before she even realized she'd been pushed. 1 second she was standing at the top, staring at her husband's face. The next, the world tilted. Her shoulder caught the railing, her hip slammed a step, and then the marble floor of the entryway rose up and met her like it had been waiting. The sound her body made was something she would never be able to describe. Not a crash, not a scream, just a dull, awful finality. She lay there, cheek pressed against cold stone, and the first thing she felt wasn't pain. It was silence. Jaewon stood at the top of the staircase, chest heaving, one hand still slightly raised from where he had shoved her. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something that has inconvenienced him. Not horror, not regret, just a cold, quiet calculation, like he was deciding whether she was still a problem. Then he turned around and walked back into the bedroom. And Claire lay at the bottom of the stairs in her own home, alone, and understood that she had never actually known him at all. But that's where this story ends. Let's go back to where it really began to break. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here, you already know we don't do anything halfway. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button because this one is going to stay with you. Now, let's talk about Claire Bennett. 12 hours before she hit that floor, Claire was standing in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, in a silk robe she'd had for 4 years, making coffee she didn't really want. The house was quiet in the way that big houses got quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. Jaewon had left before she woke up, which wasn't unusual anymore. She'd stopped tracking his schedule the way she used to. She'd stopped a lot of things she used to do, though she couldn't always name exactly when. She picked up her phone out of habit and opened her email, scanning through the usual. Newsletters, a message from her architect friend back in L.A., a few forwarded company threads that Jaewon's assistant copied her on as a courtesy, even though she hadn't held a real seat at the table in over a year. She was still listed as co-founder on the website. She checked once, just the once. She was about to set the phone down when a calendar notification she didn't recognize made her pause. It was synced to the shared household account they'd set up years ago, originally for joint appointments, anniversaries, the kind of administrative intimacy that came with building a life with someone. The notification was for a reservation, a restaurant she knew, a table for 2, tonight at 8, under Jaewon's name. Claire stared at it. Tonight was Thursday. They didn't have plans. She would have known if they had plans. She had nothing but time to track plans these days. She pressed on the calendar entry, and a name appeared in the notes field. A single name. SEO Yan. Claire set the mug down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to go uncertain, and she stood in her kitchen for a long moment doing nothing at all. The name wasn't new to her. Not exactly. SEO Yan Park was the head of the company's investor relations department. A woman who had joined the team 14 months ago, poised and polished in the way of someone who understood exactly how to be seen. Claire had met her at a company dinner. They had shaken hands. Seo Yan had smiled and told Claire that she'd heard so much about her, and that it was such an honor to finally meet the woman who started it all. Claire had smiled back and thought nothing of it, because she had trusted her husband completely. She stood in the kitchen and thought about that now, about the shape of that smile. She could have put the phone down. She almost did. But there was something specific and quiet that had shifted in the air the moment she read that name. Some door that had always been slightly ajar, swinging open just enough. And Claire, who had spent the last year being careful and small and accommodating, felt something old and sharp wake up in the back of her chest. She opened her laptop. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself it was just dinner. She told herself a lot of things as her fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up the shared cloud drive that she still had access to because no one had ever taken the trouble to remove her. She found the first file by accident. It was labeled with a date from 11 months ago and nested inside a folder she'd never seen before, buried under a cascade of quarterly reports. She clicked it because the file name was a string of numbers that meant nothing, and sometimes the files that meant nothing were the ones that mattered most. It was a memo, internal, marked confidential, addressed to the board. And it outlined, in the clean, bloodless language of corporate restructuring, a proposal to formally transition the role of co-founder to honorary status, which was another way of saying decorative, ceremonial, gone. It was dated 11 months ago. Claire read it 3 times. Then she opened the next file, then the next. She sat at that kitchen counter for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she did not move, did not make a sound, did not cry. She moved through document after document with the same focused stillness that had once made her the sharpest person in any room she walked into, the same stillness Jae-won had fallen in love with once across a conference room in Los Angeles when she was someone who took up space without apologizing for it. What she found was not just an affair. What she found was a campaign, 14 months of it. Quietly, systematically, Jae-won had been constructing a version of the company in which Claire Bennett did not exist. Redirected credits, her name absent from new patent, filings she had originated, her equity structure flagged for a review that had conveniently never been communicated to her. And underneath all of it, woven through the financials like a thread she wasn't supposed to find, something that made her breath stop entirely. Numbers that didn't add up, transactions that moved through shell subsidiaries, contracts with vendors that didn't appear to exist outside of their own paperwork. Claire had the brains. That was always how they described it. He had the funds. She had the brains. And those brains were now sitting very still and very cold, recognizing a pattern that she'd seen once in a corporate fraud case study during her postgrad. The kind of thing used as a cautionary example, the kind of thing nobody actually thought happened to them. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She needed to be sure. She needed to be exact. Because what she was holding, if she was reading it correctly, was not just evidence of a husband who had betrayed her. It was evidence of a man who had used the company she built to run money that didn't belong there, and had spent the last year methodically removing her from the picture before anyone could trace a line back through the parts she understood. She wasn't a loose end because of the affair. The affair was a distraction. She was a loose end because she was the only person alive who knew this company from the inside out, who could look at these numbers and immediately understand what she was seeing. Claire sat in her kitchen in her silk robe as the morning light shifted across the floor and the coffee went completely cold, and she thought about the man she'd met at a conference 9 years ago who had found her afterward in the corridor and said everyone in that room was looking at the wrong person. She had laughed. She had thought he was charming. She thought about that now. Then she picked up the phone, opened a blank document, and started writing. Everything down. We're just getting started, and I already need to know. Did you see it coming? Drop your answer in the comments and share this with someone who needs to see Claire's story. 9 years ago, Claire Bennett walked into a startup conference in Los Angeles wearing a white blazer she'd saved 3 months to buy, carrying a pitch deck she'd rebuilt from scratch 4 times, and absolutely certain that this was the week everything would change. She was right, just not in the way she expected. The conference was held at a hotel downtown, the kind of place that smelled like ambition and catered coffee, full of people who were either already successful or performing it convincingly. Claire was neither. She was 27, running a design tech firm out of a shared office in Culver City with 2 employees and a vision so specific and so alive that it kept her up most nights, not with anxiety, but with the restless urgency of someone who could see exactly where she was going and couldn't get there fast enough. She presented on day 2, slot 4, which was the graveyard slot that came right after lunch when the room was warm and attention spans had started their slow afternoon decline. She stood at the front anyway, clicked to her first slide, and spoke like the room was full of people who had no choice but to listen. Halfway through, she noticed him. He was sitting near the back. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of stillness that didn't read as disinterest, but rather as someone paying the specific, undivided attention that most people only pretended to pay. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't glancing at the door. He was watching her the way you watch something you've been trying to understand and have finally started to. She didn't let it break her rhythm. She finished her pitch, took 3 questions from the front rows, and walked off the stage feeling the way she always felt after a good presentation. hollowed out and electric all at once. She was in the corridor 20 minutes later, heels off, leaning against the wall with a glass of water, when he appeared. Everyone in that room, he said without introduction, without preamble, was looking at the wrong thing. She looked at him. They were supposed to be looking at the slides. Exactly. He tilted his head slightly. Your slides were the best in the room, and they still couldn't hold attention the way you did. That's not a presentation skill. That's something else entirely. He extended his hand. Kim Jae-won. I know who you are, she said, and shook it. Claire Bennett. And before you say whatever you came out here to say, I'm not looking for an investor. I'm looking for a partner. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. That's exactly what I came out here to say. They talked for 4 hours that night. They sat in the hotel bar long after it emptied out. Two people leaning across a small table with the intensity of people who have found, unexpectedly, someone who speaks the same language. His company was infrastructure, capital, networks, the financial architecture that made ambitious things possible. Hers was vision, design, functionality, the human element that made ambitious things matter. They were, on paper, opposites. In practice, they were two halves of the same argument. By day 3, they were having breakfast together before sessions. By day 5, they were finishing each other's thoughts in the middle of conversations about markets and meaning and what it actually meant to build something that lasted. On the last night of the conference, they sat on the hotel rooftop and Jae-won looked at her sideways and said, Tell me you've thought about what happens if we don't leave this week as separate companies. Claire looked out at the city. She had thought about it. She thought about nothing else for 48 hours. I'd need to retain creative control, she said, obviously. And equal standing, not on paper, actually equal. I wouldn't want it any other way. She turned and looked at him then, this man she had known for 6 days, and felt something settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. Then let's build something neither of us could build alone, she said. He smiled, and it was the most unguarded she ever saw him. They merged the companies within 4 months. Claire packed her apartment in L.A. into 12 boxes, shipped most of it, carried the rest, and landed in Seoul in the middle of October with the particular fearlessness of someone who has decided to bet entirely on herself. Jae-won met her at the airport with terrible coffee from the arrivals hall and a folder of office lease options he'd already shortlisted, and she laughed so hard she nearly dropped everything, because of course he had. The first year was relentless and extraordinary. They built the company the way people build things when they're genuinely aligned. With friction, yes, and arguments that went long into the night, but always with the same North Star, always moving. Claire's design, philosophy fused with Jae-won's operational precision, created something the industry hadn't quite seen before, and the market noticed. By the end of year 2, they were fielding acquisition offers they had absolutely no intention of accepting. By year 3, they were the ones acquiring. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, they fell in love. It happened the way real things happen, not in a moment, but across 100 small ones. The way he learned that she thought better when she was walking and started scheduling their hardest conversations as walks through whatever neighborhood they found themselves in. The way she started keeping a second coffee cup on her desk because he'd appear in her office doorway at 10 a.m. without fail, and she liked that she could count on him. The way they stopped being careful around each other and started just being themselves. Messy, brilliant, certain. The wedding was small and perfect. Claire wore a dress she designed herself, ivory with gold at the collar, and Jae-won looked at her walking toward him with an expression she kept like a photograph in the back of her mind for years afterward. His mother cried. Her mother video-called from Atlanta and cried louder. They danced badly and laughed about it, and nobody cared. She was 31 years old, and she felt, for the first time in her life, like everything had arrived exactly as it was supposed to. Then they decided to start a family, and the world shifted in ways neither of them knew how to hold. The first month, nothing happened, then the next. Then, the careful optimism of the early months curdled slowly into something more clinical. Appointments, terminology, the specific grief of being told that what you want is not impossible, just difficult, which sometimes felt like a crueler answer than no. Claire moved through it with the same discipline she moved through everything, researching, advocating, trying. What she didn't fully account for was what it would cost her quietly underneath all that doing. She started pulling back, not dramatically, just degrees. She stopped wearing the red coat she loved because it felt like too much. She started letting Jaewon make decisions she would have once insisted on making together. She smiled more and said less and told herself this was what it looked like to be a supportive wife, to be present for the process, to be smaller. She was making herself smaller, and she didn't have a name for it then. When the doctor gently suggested that sustained stress could be a significant factor, Claire stepped back from the company officially. It felt like the right thing. Jaewon had agreed with a care that she read as tenderness, and which she now understood was relief. She left the center of the thing she had built. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things, and Jaewon, in the space that opened up when she stepped back, filled it with someone else. By noon, Claire had filled 6 pages. Not emotionally, not in the scattered, shaking way of a woman coming apart. She wrote the way she used to write in boardrooms, precise, sequential, every detail anchored to a date and a document. She had always been the one who could hold the full architecture of a thing in her head, see how each piece connected to the next, trace the logic of a structure from foundation to roof. That skill had built a company. Now it was building a case. She documented the memo first, then the equity review she'd never been notified about. Then she went back through 14 months of financial threads and pulled every transaction that didn't have a clean, traceable origin. There were 11 of them. 11 separate movements of money through subsidiaries that existed only as addresses and registration numbers, flowing in from sources that, when she searched them, returned nothing. No web presence, no physical location, no staff. She knew what this was. She had always known the moment the pattern appeared, but she needed the full shape of it before she allowed herself to say it plainly, even in her own head. This was how Jaewon had maintained his position in certain circles that didn't advertise themselves. This was how the company's growth in its 3rd and 4th year had moved faster than their legitimate revenue should have allowed. She had celebrated those numbers. She had been proud of those numbers. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then she kept writing. At 12:30, her phone rang. Jaewon's name on the screen. She stared at it through 4 full rings, watching it the way you watch something that cannot hurt you anymore because you have already moved past the point where it could. She let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. She went back to the documents. It was around 2 in the afternoon when she found the messages. She hadn't gone looking for them specifically. She'd been cross-referencing a vendor contract and found herself in a folder that hadn't been archived properly, or maybe had been archived carelessly by a man who had stopped worrying about what his wife might find because his wife had spent a year being quiet and accommodating and small. The folder contained a mirrored backup of a messaging thread, the kind that synced automatically to cloud without thinking about it, and Claire opened it with the same neutral expression she'd been wearing all morning and started to read. She read for a long time. The messages between Jaewon and Seo Yeon Park went back 13 months. They were not ambiguous. They were not something that could be reframed or explained away, and Claire noticed with a strange, distant clarity that she wasn't even looking for a way to do that. She read them like evidence because that was what they were. What she had not been prepared for was the particular texture of them. It wasn't just intimacy, it was familiarity. The kind that accumulated over shared time and private jokes and 100 small moments that belonged, by every right, Claire understood, to her. Jaewon wrote to Seo Yeon the way he used to write to Claire in their first year. Unguarded, easy, like a man who had taken his careful public self entirely off. There was a message from 8 months ago where he described a dinner he and Claire had attended together. And the way he described it, she spent the whole night talking to the Yoon group wife. I sat there thinking about you the entire time, made something in Claire's chest go so quiet that for a moment she couldn't locate her own heartbeat. She had worn the green dress to that dinner. She remembered because Jaewon had told her she looked beautiful, and she had held on to that compliment for days afterward, carefully, the way you held on to things when they had started to feel rare. She set the phone face down on the counter. She sat without moving for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then she turned the phone back over, screenshotted every message, and kept going. At 3:15, she found the one that rearranged everything. It was from 4 months ago. Jaewon to Seo Yeon, late on a Tuesday night. The Claire situation is taking longer than I thought. The lawyers say we have to be careful about the equity structure, or it looks deliberate. Give it another quarter. By summer, she won't have grounds to contest anything. Claire read it twice. The Claire situation. She had a name in this house, in this company, in this marriage, and he had reduced her to a situation in a message to the woman he was sleeping with while Claire was upstairs, probably asleep, probably already making herself smaller so he could have more room. She stood up from the counter and walked to the window and looked out at the garden for a very long time. She was not going to cry. Not yet. Not here. Not alone in this kitchen where she'd made his coffee. Every morning for 6 years with the specific care of a woman who believed the small things mattered. She was going to feel this. She would feel all of it. She promised herself that. But not until she had everything she needed. Not until she was finished. She went back to the laptop. By 5 o'clock she had a complete picture. And just after 5 her phone rang again. Not Jaewon this time, but a number she recognized immediately. She stood very still for 1 second, then answered. Claire. The voice on the other end was careful. Warm in the way of someone who had been waiting a long time to be let back in. Nadia, her oldest friend. The one who had sat across from her 2 years ago at a restaurant in Gangnam and said, quietly, "Something is off with him. I don't know what it is, but I need you to know I see it." And Claire, who had been so certain, so completely certain, had reached across the table and squeezed Nadia's hand and said, "I know you love me, and I hear you, but you're wrong." She had not been wrong. "Nadia," Claire said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I need to tell you something." The silence on the other end lasted only a second. "Tell me." "I was wrong. About everything. And I need—" She stopped, pressed her fingers to her eyes, held it. "I need someone in my corner tonight." "I'm already in the car," Nadia said and hung up. Claire set the phone down and stood in the middle of her kitchen and let herself feel, for exactly 3 minutes, the full weight of what she'd spent the day uncovering. She thought about the conference, the rooftop, the terrible arrivals hall coffee, and the folder of office leases that made her laugh until she dropped everything. She thought about the green dress. She thought about standing at an altar in ivory and gold, looking at a man who looked back at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. She thought about all the ways a person could look at someone and not see them at all. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, squared her shoulders, closed every document on the laptop, but not before copying everything, all of it, to an external drive she pulled from the bottom drawer of her home office, the one she hadn't opened in over a year. She was upstairs changing when she heard the front door open. Jaewon's footsteps crossed the ground floor in the particular pattern she had memorized without meaning to over 6 years of living with someone. Foyer, left to the kitchen. Pause, then the stairs. She stood in the middle of their bedroom and listened to him climb toward her. He appeared in the doorway, still in his coat. He looked at her, and something moved briefly behind his eyes, a flicker of assessment that she now understood for exactly what it was. "You didn't answer when I called," he said. "I was busy," she said. He studied her. "Are you all right?" Claire looked at her husband, at the face, she had trusted completely, unreservedly, for 9 years, at the man who had a dinner reservation tonight with the woman he'd been dismantling her life for. "I'm fine," she said and smiled. "How was your day?" He relaxed. That was the thing that would stay with her longest, how quickly he relaxed. Nadia arrived at 8:15, 45 minutes after Jaewon left for his dinner reservation. Claire had watched him dress from the edge of the bed, asking him small questions in a calm, pleasant voice. How the board meeting had gone, whether he wanted her to reschedule their weekend plans with the Choi, whether he'd eaten anything since morning. He'd answered all of it easily, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror, and Claire had sat there watching the reflection of a man who had no idea that the ground under his feet had already shifted completely, and she had felt something she didn't expect. Not rage, not grief, clarity. The kind that arrived sometimes on the other side of the worst thing, clean and sharp and utterly without sentiment. He kissed her forehead before he left. She let him. When the front door closed, she sat in the silence for exactly 30 seconds, and then she went downstairs and poured herself a glass of water and waited for Nadia. Nadia walked through the door and didn't say a word. She just looked at Claire, at her still hands and her level eyes and the particular set of her jaw that she'd known since they were 23, and crossed the room and held her. Claire stood inside that embrace and felt, briefly, the full tenderness of being known by someone who had never stopped showing up, even when she'd been turned away. "I should have listened to you," Claire said into her shoulder. "You listened when it mattered," Nadia said. "That's enough." They sat at the kitchen counter together, and Claire walked her through everything, all 6 pages, every document, every transaction, every message. Nadia was not a quiet listener. She made sounds, sharp intakes of breath, one moment where she put the phone down and pressed both hands flat on the counter and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, but she didn't interrupt. She let Claire lay the whole architecture of it out, piece by piece, until it was all visible between them under the kitchen light. When Claire finished, Nadia was quiet for a long time. "The fraud," she said finally. "Claire, do you understand what that means?" "I understand exactly what it means. You need a lawyer. Tonight, not tomorrow." "I know." Claire turned the glass of water slowly in her hands. "I know someone. I've already drafted the message. I needed to say it out loud to another person first, to make sure I wasn't—" She stopped. "You're not," Nadia said firmly. "You are not overreacting. You are not misreading. And you are not wrong. You have never been wrong about a set of numbers in your life." Claire almost smiled. "He really thought I wouldn't find it." "He thought you'd become someone who wouldn't look." Nadia's voice was quiet and exact. "That's not the same thing as you actually changing." That landed somewhere deep. Claire held it for a moment, then nodded once and reached for her phone. She had sent the message to her lawyer, Mi Ray Song, a woman she had worked with early in the company's formation and whose private number she had kept all these years with the instinct of someone who believed in being prepared, and was waiting for the reply when she heard the front door open. It was barely past 9. She had not expected him back until midnight at least. She and Nadia both went still. Jaewon's footsteps moved through the foyer, faster than usual. Claire stood up from the counter slowly, and Nadia rose beside her, and they both turned to face the kitchen doorway when he appeared in it. He looked at Claire, then at Nadia, then back at Claire. And she saw it. The precise moment he understood that something was wrong. Not the guilt of a man caught in an affair, something older and colder than that. The calculation of a man who had been managing a situation and had just registered that the situation had changed. "Nadia," he said very evenly, "I didn't know you were here. I was just leaving," Nadia said, and looked at Claire with an expression that said clearly, "I am not actually leaving." She picked up her bag, squeezed Claire's hand once, and walked past Jaewon toward the front of the house. And Claire heard the front door open and not fully close, and understood. She turned back to Jaewon. They stood in the kitchen and looked at each other, and the air between them was different now, stripped of the performance they'd both been giving for different reasons, down to something that had no social coating left on it. "You went through my files," he said, not a question. "Our files," Claire said. "The company we built together. Those files." His jaw shifted. "Claire, the restructuring memo." She kept her voice level, unhurried. "The equity review, the 11 transactions, the messages." She paused. "The Claire situation." Something moved across his face then. Not remorse, she noted. Not even the shame of a man who had been genuinely wrong. It was the brief exposed expression of someone recalibrating how much damage had been done and how quickly they needed to manage it. "You have to understand," he started, and his voice had shifted into the register he used in negotiations, measured, reasonable, slightly warm around the edges. "The company needed—" "I understand everything," Claire said. "That's the problem for you." He crossed the kitchen toward her, and she held her ground. He stopped close enough that she could see the exact quality of the look in his eyes, the one she had misread 100 times as intensity and now recognized as control. "You don't have the full picture," he said. "If you would just let me explain." "Explain the money," she said. "Or explain Seo-Yeon." The name cracked something open. His composure slipped. Just a fraction, just for a second. And in that second, she saw the thing underneath, which was not love or guilt or grief, but simply the naked fury of a man who believed he had arranged everything carefully and was watching it come apart. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said quietly. "What you're about to do. You want to burn everything we built?" "You already burned it," Claire said. "I'm just deciding what to do with the ash." She moved a step past him toward the stairs. She needed to get to the home office, the external drive. She needed to— His hand closed around her wrist, not gently. "You're not going to do anything tonight," he said, and his voice had dropped to something she had never heard from him before, low and flat and without any warmth at all. "You're going to sleep on this, and in the morning we are going to sit down and talk about this like adults. Let go of my wrist, Jae-won." "Claire, let go." He released her. She turned toward the stairs. She was on the third step when he said her name again, sharp, clipped, and she turned back to look at him, and she saw in his face the exact moment. The decision was made, the moment the careful, managing, calculating man gave way to something uglier and more honest, and she had just enough time to register that she was at the top of nothing and the bottom of everything before his hands hit her shoulders and the world tilted and the stairs were gone, and the marble floor was not. She lay at the bottom, and the house was absolutely silent. Above her, Jae-won stood at the top of the staircase, chest heaving. He looked down at her. The calculation returned almost immediately, chasing out whatever had broken through. He stared at her for a long moment with the face of a stranger. Then he turned around and walked back into the bedroom and closed the door. Claire lay on the cold floor of her own home with her cheek against the marble and her wrist throbbing and her shoulder screaming. And the first thing she felt wasn't pain. It was the end of something. And then, quietly, underneath that, already beginning, the beginning of something else, she heard the front door open. Soft, quick footsteps. Nadia's face appeared above her, pale and fierce, and her voice when she spoke was completely steady because she understood that this was not the moment for falling apart. That would come later. Right now, there was only this. "I've got you," Nadia said. "I've got you. Can you move?" Claire looked up at the ceiling of the house she had furnished and loved and made into a home, and she took one breath, and then another. "Yes," she said. "Help me up. Help me." She did not go to a hospital that night. She went to Nadia's apartment, 15 minutes away, where Nadia sat her on the bathroom counter and checked every place that hurt with the careful, methodical attention of someone who loved her, and said nothing about the fact that her hands were shaking the entire time. Claire's wrist was badly bruised, but not broken. Her shoulder would darken by morning. She sat under the bathroom light and let Nadia work and stared at the wall and felt, for the first time all day, the full weight of everything she had been carrying. She did not cry for Jae-won. She cried for the girl at the conference in the white blazer she'd saved 3 months to buy. She cried for the rooftop, and the terrible coffee, and the small wedding with the ivory and gold dress. She cried for every month she had sat in a doctor's office and quietly, privately, blamed herself. And for every degree she had made herself smaller in response, as though shrinking was the same thing as sacrifice. She cried, too, for the nursery she had painted in her head 100 times and never built, for the months of hoping and the clinical language of disappointment, and the way she had let that particular grief convince her that she was somehow less whole, less worthy, less deserving of the space she had once occupied so naturally. She had spent years quietly measuring her value against something that was never the full measure of her. She understood that now. Not as a consolation. Not as something to make the loss smaller. Because the loss was real and it was hers and she would carry it. But she was more than what she had not been able to give. And the woman she was becoming had room for that grief without being defined by it. She cried for the woman she had been before she confused loving someone with disappearing into them. She cried for exactly 11 minutes. Nadia sat beside her and didn't say a word, which was the only right thing to do. Then Claire washed her face, borrowed a clean shirt, and sat at Nadia's kitchen table with her laptop and the external drive, and worked until 3 in the morning. Mi-Ray Song, her lawyer, replied at 11 that night. She had read everything Claire forwarded, and her message was 4 sentences long, which told Claire everything she needed to know about how serious it was. They scheduled a call for 7 the next morning. Claire slept for 4 hours on Nadia's couch, flat on her back, staring at the ceiling until sleep arrived less like rest and more like a door closing briefly against everything outside. In the morning she was awake before the alarm. What followed was not a single dramatic moment. It was 31 days of precise, quiet movement. Mi-Ray connected Claire with a forensic accountant within 48 hours. The accountant spent a week with the documents and came back with a report that was, in his words, one of the cleaner fraud structures he'd encountered, which was, not a compliment, the shell subsidiaries traced back to a network of investors that had no legitimate reason to be anywhere near a design tech company. The money that had moved through them was significant enough that when the report landed on the right desk, it landed with weight. Claire filed for divorce on day 8. She did not tell Jae-won in advance. She did not send a message or request a conversation. She instructed Mi-Ray, and Mi-Ray moved, and Jae-won was served on a Tuesday afternoon in his own office, the office that had been built on a foundation Claire had designed, by a process server who had no interest in his reaction. She heard from Nadia that he had called 3 times that evening. She did not answer. On day 14, the financial authorities made their first formal inquiry to the company's board. Claire had already submitted her documentation through proper legal channels and removed herself entirely from the process because she understood that the most powerful thing she could do now was not to fight loudly, but to be completely, immovably correct. She had the receipts, she had the dates, she had 11 transactions, and a forensic accountant's report, and a lawyer who had stopped sleeping properly because she was that invested in the outcome. Jae-won's world began to contract. The board convened an emergency session. 3 of the 5 members had not known. Claire believed that because she had known those people for years, and because the fraud had been structured specifically to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking from the inside. 2 of them called Claire directly. She answered those calls because she had learned the difference between the people who had been in the dark and the people who had done the darkening. Seo-yeon Park resigned from investor relations on day 19. Claire heard about it the way she heard about most things during that period. Through Mi-Ray, through Nadia, through the particular information ecology of a company in crisis. What she learned later, through the legal process, was that Seo-yeon had not resigned out of guilt or loyalty. She had resigned because investigators had begun asking questions about the investor relations department's handling of several of the flagged transactions, and Seo-yeon Park, who had understood from the beginning exactly what kind of man she was involved with and had made her calculations accordingly, had decided that self-preservation looked better than solidarity. She cooperated with investigators fully. She was the final piece. On day 26, Jae-won was arrested at the company headquarters at 9 in the morning. Claire was not there. She was at Mi-Ray's office, signing paperwork, and she heard about it from a news alert on her phone. His name, the charges, the brief and brutal summary of what had been found. She looked at the notification for a long moment. Then she put the phone face down on Mi-Ray's conference table and finished signing the paperwork. Mi-Ray looked at her carefully. "How are you?" "Hungry," Claire said. "Can we get something to eat after this?" They got Korean barbecue and sat for 2 hours and talked about everything except Jae-won, and it was the best meal Claire had eaten in longer than she could remember. He came to her on day 29. She had agreed to one meeting, through lawyers, because Mireille advised it, and because Claire trusted Mireille's judgment more than her own feelings about it. They met in a neutral space, a conference room, clean and featureless, which felt appropriate. Jaewon came in looking like a man who had not slept in a month, which was probably accurate, and Claire came in looking like herself, which she was only just beginning to remember how to do. He sat across from her, and for a long moment said nothing. Then he said, "I'm sorry." Claire listened to the words, turned them over, assessed them with the same neutrality she had, brought to the documents, the transactions, the messages. "I know," she said. "I think you probably are." "Claire, I think you're sorry because it fell apart," she said, not unkindly. "I think you're sorry because you're sitting where you're sitting. And I think somewhere, underneath all of that, there might be something real. But that's for you to work out." She paused. "It has nothing to do with me anymore." He looked at her with the face of a man who had expected something different. Tears or fury, or the door cracking open. Any of the things that might have happened a year ago. Instead, he got Claire Bennett, entirely present and entirely finished. And she watched him understand that there was nothing to negotiate here. She reached into the folder in front of her and slid a business card across the table. Mireille's number on one side, the forensic accountant's recommendation for a defense attorney on the other. "I hope you find your way through this," she said, and he meant it with the clean, distant sincerity of someone who had genuinely moved on. "I really do." She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. The full legal transfer of her equity and co-founder authority was completed on day 31. Claire stood in the office on a Thursday morning, her office now, functionally and formally, the one she had designed from the floor plan up 8 years ago when Seoul was still new and everything felt like it was being built for the first time. And she stood at the window and looked out at the city and felt the particular quality of a silence that was not empty, but full. She had a meeting in an hour, a designer she was bringing back onto the team, someone she'd wanted for years. After that, a call with the 2 board members who had reached out, who were already talking about a restructuring that looked a great deal like the company Claire had always envisioned it becoming. After that, nothing. The evening was entirely hers. She turned from the window and sat at her desk and opened her laptop and pulled up a design file she hadn't looked at in over a year, a project she'd been developing quietly before everything, before the stepping back and the shrinking and the silence. She looked at it for a moment, then she started working. Not to prove anything, not to anyone, just because it was hers and she was good at it, and the morning light was coming through the window at exactly the right angle, and she was still here. Claire Bennett was still here, and she was just getting started. And that's Claire's story. I need to know, what was the moment that hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments right now, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see what a woman looks like when she finally chooses herself. Like this video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. The Nesties already know, we don't do anything halfway.